Welcome to Mountain Living, the Pros and Cons, a show that dives into the unique challenges and rewards of living in remote mountain communities. Whether you're a nature lover looking for a change of pace or a remote worker seeking a secluded retreat, there are many things to consider before making the move to the mountains. From access to necessities and weather conditions, to transportation and employment opportunities, we'll explore the top 10 factors to keep in mind when deciding to live in a remote mountain area. Join us as we get a glimpse into the pros and cons of mountain living. So, come along for the journey and discover if mountain living is right for you. Number 10. Access to necessities. Living in a remote area can present challenges when it comes to accessing necessities such as food, medical care, and other basic services. Food can be difficult to come by in remote areas, as supermarkets and other grocery stores may be far away. Many remote communities rely on hunting, fishing, and gardening to supplement their food supply. Medical care can also be limited in remote areas, as there may be few or no doctors or hospitals nearby. In these cases, telemedicine and other remote healthcare options may be used to provide medical services. Basic services such as electricity, water, and internet may also be limited or unavailable in remote areas. In many cases, remote communities rely on generators, wells, and satellite internet to meet these needs. Overall, living in remote areas can be difficult, but with proper planning and resources, one can access necessities. Number 9. Weather conditions. Different regions have different climates and weather patterns that can greatly impact your ability to live sustainably. A cold or snowy climate will require planning for staying warm in the winter. This may include installing a wood stove or other heating system, and insulating your home properly to retain heat. It is also important to consider the long-term climate patterns of the area, such as potential for natural disasters like wildfires. It's important to research the climate of the area you're considering and make sure you understand the specific challenges it presents. This will help you make informed decisions about the best way to set up your remote living situation. Number 8. Legal considerations. Legal considerations are important to research and understand before deciding to live off the grid. Each state and municipality may have different laws and regulations regarding off-grid living, so it's important to do your research and understand what is allowed and what is not in the area you're considering. Building codes, zoning laws, property rights, and environmental regulations. For example, some states have strict regulations on wastewater treatment and disposal, which could impact your ability to set up a septic system. It is important to check with local authorities and seek professional legal advice to help you understand and comply with all regulations, laws, and permits required. Number 7. The cost. The costs associated with building and maintaining an off-grid living setup can vary greatly depending on factors such as location, climate, and the size and complexity of your setup. Here are a few key cost considerations to keep in mind. Land and property, the cost of purchasing land and property. Infrastructure, the cost of setting up and maintaining the infrastructure necessary for off-grid living can be substantial. This may include the cost of installing a well, septic system, solar panels, and backup generators, as well as the cost of maintaining these systems over time. Building materials, the cost of building materials for an off-grid home can be higher than for a traditional home, due to the need for materials that are suitable for off-grid living, such as solar panels, batteries, and rainwater harvesting systems. Food and supplies, the cost of producing and sourcing food and supplies can be higher when living off the grid. You may need to invest in equipment such as a greenhouse, irrigation system, or generator to grow your own food and have enough water supply. Insurance. The cost of insurance may be higher when living off the grid, as standard home insurance policies may not cover certain types of off-grid infrastructure. Transportation. The cost of transportation may be higher when living off the grid, as you may need to travel further to access goods and services that you cannot produce or find locally. It is important to research and budget for all of these costs in order to ensure that off-grid living is financially feasible for you. A good way to do this is to create a detailed budget and a plan for financing your off-grid living setup. Number 6. Transportation. Transportation is an important factor to consider when deciding to live off the grid. Living off the grid often means living in remote or rural areas, which can make it difficult to access goods and services that are not available locally. Here are a few key transportation considerations to keep in mind. Distance to nearest town or city. Consider how far away the nearest town or city is from the location you're considering for off-grid living. The further away it is, the more difficult it will be to access goods and services that are not available locally. Road condition. Research the condition of the roads leading to the location you're considering. In some remote areas, roads may not be paved or may be impassable in certain weather conditions. Public transportation. Look into the availability of public transportation in the area you're considering. In some remote areas, there may be no public transportation options available, which can make it difficult to access goods and services that are not available locally. Personal transportation. Consider what type of personal transportation you will need to access goods and services that are not available locally. You may need to invest in a vehicle with four-wheel drive or a high clearance, or a boat to reach certain areas. Cost of transportation. Be aware that the cost of transportation may be higher when living off the grid, as you may need to travel further to access goods and services that you cannot produce or find locally. Number 5. Communication. Communication is an important factor to consider when deciding to live off the grid. Although living off the grid can provide a sense of isolation and self-sufficiency, it's important to have access to basic communication tools in case of emergency. Here are a few key communication considerations to keep in mind. Telephone service. Consider the availability of telephone service in the area you're considering. You may need to install a telephone line or use a satellite phone to ensure that you have access to phone service. Internet service. Evaluate the availability of internet service in the area you're considering. You may need to install a satellite internet system or use a cellular data plan to ensure that you have access to the internet. Mail service. Look into the availability of mail service in the area you're considering. In some remote areas, mail may only be delivered a few times a week, so you may need to plan ahead for receiving mail and packages. Emergency communication. Consider the availability of emergency communication systems in the area you're considering. Some remote areas may not have cell phone service, so you may need to invest in an emergency radio or satellite phone for emergency communication. It is important to research and plan for communication needs before making the decision to live off the grid. This can help to ensure that you have access to the communication tools that you need to stay connected and safe while living off the grid. Number 4. Healthcare. Healthcare is an important factor to consider when deciding to live off the grid. Living in a remote or rural area can make it difficult to access medical care in case of an emergency or illness. It's important to research the availability of medical facilities and emergency services in the area you're considering. Here are a few key healthcare considerations to keep in mind. Distance to nearest hospital. Consider how far away the nearest hospital is from the location you're considering for off-grid living. The further away it is, the more difficult it will be to access medical care in case of an emergency. Availability of primary care. Look into the availability of primary care physicians or clinics in the area you're considering. Having a primary care physician nearby can be important for ongoing medical needs. Specialty care. Research the availability of specialists in the area you're considering. If you have a condition that requires specialized care, you'll need to ensure that there are specialists nearby who can treat you. Emergency services. Consider the availability of emergency services in the area you're considering. This includes things like ambulance services, as well as fire and rescue services. Insurance coverage. Be aware of your insurance coverage when living off the grid. Some insurance plans may not cover medical care in certain remote areas, so you may need to purchase additional coverage. It is important to research and plan for healthcare needs before making the decision to live off the grid. This can help to ensure that you have access to the medical care that you need to stay healthy and safe while living off the grid. Number 3. Community. Community is an important factor to consider when deciding to live off the grid. Living off the grid can provide a sense of isolation and self-sufficiency, but it's also important to have a sense of community and social connections. Here are a few key community considerations to keep in mind. Like-minded community. Consider whether there is a like-minded community nearby that you can connect with. This may include people who share your interest in off-grid living, homesteading, or sustainable living. Support network. Look into the availability of a support network in the area you're considering. This may include things like community centers, churches, and other organizations that can provide social connections and support. Volunteer opportunities. Research volunteer opportunities in the area you're considering. Volunteer work can be a great way to meet new people and make connections in the community. Local events. Look into local events and activities that take place in the area you're considering. These can be a great way to meet new people and get involved in the community. Distance from friends and family. Consider the distance from your friends and family. Living off the grid can provide a sense of isolation, so it's important to have a support system nearby. It is important to research and plan for community needs before making the decision to live off the grid. This can help to ensure that you have access to the social connections and support that you need while living off the grid. Number 2. Safety. Living in a remote or rural area may mean that crime is less of a concern, but it's still important to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect yourself and your property. Wildlife. Consider the risk of wildlife in the area you're considering. This may include things like bears, snakes, and other dangerous animals. Learn about the animals that are native to the area. Emergency planning. Develop an emergency plan for yourself and your family in case of an emergency. This may include things like evacuation routes and a plan for how to communicate during an emergency. Personal security. Take steps to ensure your personal security. This may include things like installing security cameras, alarm systems, or fence to protect your property. It is important to research and plan for safety needs before making the decision to live off the grid. This can help to ensure that you and your family are protected from potential risks and can stay safe while living off the grid. And finally, number 1. Long-term feasibility. Long-term feasibility is an important factor to consider when deciding to live off the grid. While living off the grid can be a rewarding and sustainable lifestyle choice, it's important to consider whether it is a feasible option for you and your family in the long term. Here are a few key long-term feasibility considerations to keep in mind. Finances. Consider whether you have the financial resources to sustain an off-grid lifestyle in the long term. Living off the grid can be expensive, and you'll need to have a solid plan for financing your off-grid living setup. Health. Think about your health and the health of your family members. Living off the grid can be physically demanding, and it's important to consider whether it is a feasible option for your current and long-term health needs. Skills and knowledge. Evaluate your skills and knowledge in relation to living off the grid. You may need to acquire new skills and knowledge to sustain an off-grid lifestyle, such as gardening, animal husbandry, or DIY projects. Community. Consider whether you have a support network and community that can help you sustain an off-grid lifestyle in the long term. It is important to have a sense of community and social connections, especially in case of emergency. Flexibility. Think about whether you are able to adapt and be flexible. Living off the grid often means dealing with unexpected challenges and changes, so it's important to be able to adapt and be flexible in order to sustain an off-grid lifestyle in the long term. It is important to consider the long-term feasibility of off-grid living before making a decision. This can help to ensure that off-grid living is a viable and sustainable option for you and your family in the long term. It's essential to note that living off-grid may not be suitable for everyone, and it depends on your personal preferences and lifestyle. If you've decided to take the plunge, see the links in the description that could set you free.